Most of the big cities in America faced the same problem in this last 2-week period, and that is massive riots. Some of it has been legitimate, peaceful protesting, but an awful lot of it has turned into rioting, looting, arson, assaults on police, assaults on citizens, assaults on private property. And I thought we'd talk with Cully Stimson about that, who's a senior legal fellow for Heritage Foundation and a manager at the National Security Law Program. Cully, welcome back to the program. And isn't there something out there that can be used to stop all this nonsense? Or is it more about political will than it is about the law?
Well, you got to have the political will to hold people accountable no matter what. And the crimes that we're seeing being committed, Lars, are obviously crimes at the state level. But there are 2 federal laws that I wrote about recently that could be invoked if these people cross state lines with the intent of committing riots and committing these crimes. And so that's what we wrote about in our FoxNews.com column.
Now, in that case, if it's a federal law violation, then it becomes the Federal Department of Justice that enforces that. Is that right?
That's right. And so you'd have the FBI working with local law enforcement to collect evidence. And there's 2 acts. One's called the Federal Anti-Riot Act, which is at 18 U.S.C. 2101. And then there's another act, which is older, which is at 18 U.S.C. 2241. But the Federal Anti-Riot Act prohibits, it makes criminal federal crime if you travel in interstate commerce with the express purpose of inciting a riot or organizing or promoting, encouraging, or participating in or carrying on and committing acts of violence. And if you're convicted of that at the federal level, that's 5 years for each offense. And so we've heard in news stories that people are traveling from states to other states to participate in these riots. And if it was their express intent to do that when they cross state line and they can be found guilty of the underlying conduct, then that's the federal crime. And that has teeth.
Now, that means that, especially in those places where there's a federal boundary nearby, Manhattan, New York City would be a good example if people have crossed in from New Jersey, if there are agitators who go from New York to New Jersey or vice versa, if they cross across state lines. In my neck of the woods, cross the Columbia River, you're going from Washington to Oregon or Oregon to Washington. If you do that with the intent to go in and cause trouble, then if you can make the case, then that becomes a federal law violation. And even if the local authorities want to ignore it, the federal authorities, AG Bill Barr's department, can actually go after it.
Correct. And D.C., Maryland, and Virginia are all within a stone's throw of each other. So if people got their marching orders in Maryland and crossed into the district, or from Virginia or crossed into the district, or just did it in the district, because that's a federal enclave, and the government can prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, then they can be convicted or prosecuted for this violation of the Federal Anti-Riot Act.
But I guess the only problem with that short term is that the riots are happening right now, or the property destruction is happening now, and it has been for the last 11 or 12 days. But bringing those kind of federal prosecutions sounds like something that we wouldn't be likely to see for weeks or months, right?
That's right. And look, the vast majority of these looters and petty thieves and agitators are not going to be arrested, and they're not going to be prosecuted. And I think when the president decided to designate Antifa and other groups like them as domestic terrorists, which we talked about last time, that takes the Justice Department's eye from other cases onto this particular group and groups like it, and the full force of the federal government can be applied towards investigating those crimes. And they can also use this older federal law, which actually was designed to go after the KKK, but was used recently in Charlottesville when you had the white supremacists agitating down there in 2017, and 3 white supremacists got convicted. And that goes after people who injure, oppress, or threaten or intimidate anybody who they themselves are exercising their privileges under the Constitution, like free speech, et cetera. And there's another provision in there, Lars, which I'm sure will ring true for you because you know Antifa from what they do in Portland.
Oh, yeah.
That is, if you show up in disguise, that helps trigger that act. And, of course, these Antifa folks and folks like them are covering their faces and dressed very similar to each other for the purpose of not being caught and identified on camera.
Well, and is there a possibility to use it to go back to the folks who may be funding these? I think you and I have talked about this, about whether or not, if it's illegal to do that activity, is it illegal to stay even further in the shadows, but providing money or communications or other things to make these agitating activities possible?
Of course. There's a whole host of crimes, one that I already talked about today, which is the Federal Anti-Riot Act. I mean, remember, the language is, quote, incite, organize, promote, or encourage. So if you're funding, you're encouraging, you're helping organize, you're promoting it. You can also be convicted of conspiracy to violate the Federal Anti-Riot Act. You can be convicted of conspiracy or aiding and abetting in the violation of that or other criminal acts. So there's a whole bevy of federal criminal laws that could be applicable here, depending on the facts and circumstances in each case.
Now, what happens when you have a whole bunch of mayors and governors who appear not to be willing to take those kinds of actions, and that you at least suspect, I suspect, that the reason they're not willing to take those actions isn't because they're trying to handle these protesters with kid gloves, but because they see the protesters as advocating for the same kind of political causes they believe in, and they believe there's a political advantage. Any way to go to some of those jokers and say, by your negligence as an elected official, you're helping to facilitate this by telling your police departments, don't go enforce the law, don't stop people from doing this kind of thing?
Well, of course, the number one tool for that is political accountability at the ballot box next time they're up for election. People tend to have short memories, though. They may forget that. Another way, of course, is to if the local law enforcement is in cahoots with the government, the local government, then that makes it hard for the feds to get cooperation from the local law enforcement. But the local law enforcement in some of these jurisdictions parts ways with the local government and their leaders, and no doubt are probably trying to cooperate with the feds. But the feds don't always need local law enforcement to make cases. And remember, in the South, when the KKK was running amok and African Americans were being lynched and other horrible things were happening to them, it was the federal government that swooped in despite the efforts of the local police to thwart their efforts.
Yep.
And made cases against the members of the Klan and elsewhere. So the federal government can do it.
I mean, I can imagine, Cully, back in the day, there were probably plenty of Southern sheriffs, the ones with the fire hoses and the police dogs, who said, I'm not going to help you make a case against the Klan because they had ties into that as well.
That's right. And it was a despicable part of our past. And it is fueling part of the conversation today as you hear about various reform proposals, some ridiculous like, disbanding police departments, and others that have some merit and really require us to study and think about it and have a serious civil discussion on it. But it's hard right now, Lars, to have a civil discussion in Washington on these things because of the fervor that people feel. And when people saw that George Floyd video, they are disgusted by it, like I am. And that guy is getting prosecuted, as he should be. Of course, he's presumed innocent under the Constitution. But it has set off a national debate on reforming police departments and police practice.
And I'm glad to see it, Cully. I was telling my audience yesterday, I said, look, at the beginning of this, I saw everybody take the same position. We all saw the same evidence. And oftentimes with cases, that are similar, other police cases, you'll see a division of opinion. On this one, I saw no division. In fact, I haven't heard any voices speaking up saying that, Derek Chauvin was just doing what he was supposed to do. None of that at all. Cully Stimson is a senior legal fellow at Heritage, manager of the National Security Law Program. Cully, I appreciate you coming on.